Before Murder Inc. became the label of Chakari Orike Yakir radio hits, Chakari Gawai and platinum plaques, Chakari Grak or Ashanti love songs, Chakari flashy music videos, it felt darker, more dangerous, more like a real New York street movement that somehow got access to Def Jam budgets. And honestly, that's exactly why the Murderers album feels so special today, because this project captured Murder Inc. before everything became polished, before the mainstream fully embraced them, before the industry drama, before 50 Cent, before the FBI raids, before the jokes. This was the raw version of the empire. Now to understand this album, you gotta understand where Murder Inc. was emotionally during this era. Because around the late 90s and early 2000s, hip-hop itself felt cinematic. Albums weren't just collections of songs back then, they were experiences, movies you listened to. That's why intros mattered, skits mattered, transitions mattered, sequencing mattered. Artists wanted you to feel like you entered a world when you pressed play. And honestly, very few labels understood that better than Murder Inc., especially Irv Gotti. Now, regardless of how people feel about Irv today, one thing nobody can deny is the man understood atmosphere. He knew how to make music feel dramatic. Everything around Murder Inc. sounded emotional, dangerous, chaotic, theatrical, almost like street opera, and the Murderers album might be the purest example of that entire aesthetic. Now, one thing people forget is this wasn't some random throwaway compilation album. This project had serious energy attached to it, especially for that era, because look at the names involved. DMX, Jay-Z, Memphis, Bleak Busta Rhymes, Lil Mo. That lineup mattered heavily during that period. This was real Def Jam power. Now, another major part of what made this album feel unique was the crew itself. Because before Ashanti became the mainstream face of Murder Inc., the label's identity felt way more street-oriented. And honestly, that's where artists like Vita became incredibly important. Now, Vita's role in Murder Inc. history gets overlooked way too much today. Because when people think about female artists connected to the label, they immediately think Ashanti. But before Ashanti's commercial takeover, Vita was the original female energy inside Murder Inc. And she fit the aesthetic of this album perfectly. Aggressive, confident, comfortable inside the chaos. She didn't feel separated from the crew. She sounded like the crew. That mattered, especially on an album built around street chemistry. And honestly, part of what makes Vita so fascinating historically is the mystery around her afterward. Because during this era, she felt important to the movement. Then suddenly, she almost disappeared from mainstream music conversations completely. And honestly, that mystery adds even more mythology to this album years later. Now, another thing that made the Murderers album stand out was how alive it felt. Not polished, alive. The conversations, the tension, the humor, the skits. Everything felt intentional, especially the Chris Black skits, because those skits didn't just fill space. They moved the story forward. That's the difference between old school album construction and modern streaming era albums. Back then, albums were built like films. Now most projects are just short songs, TikTok bait, playlist filler. But the Murderers album, that project wanted you to sit inside its world. And honestly, that's why it still feels immersive today. Now, before the actual music even fully begins, there's Irv Gotti's intro. And honestly, that intro alone tells you everything about the album's energy. The way Irv talks, the confidence, and the tension. It immediately feels like you are entering Murder Inc. territory now. That intro sets the atmosphere for the entire experience. And honestly, that's something modern albums rarely even try to do anymore. Now, musically, the project itself sounded gritty. Dark beats, street records, aggressive energy. But underneath all that, there was still emotion. That's what separated Murder Inc. from everybody else. Even their hardest records still sounded cinematic emotionally. That became their signature. Now, another important thing about this album is timing, because this project dropped right before Murder Inc. fully exploded commercially, which means listening to it now almost feels eerie historically, like hearing the final raw version of the movement before Fame changed everything. Because once Ja Rule became a massive crossover superstar, once Ashanti exploded, once the radio records took over, Murder Inc.'s identity evolved completely. But this album captured the label before the polish, before the empire became mainstream. And honestly, that's exactly why real hip-hop fans still revisit it today. One of the biggest reasons the Murderers album still stands out today is simple. It didn't feel like an album. It felt like a movie. And honestly, that's something modern music barely even attempts anymore. Because back then, artists cared about atmosphere, sequencing, storytelling, transitions, immersion. They wanted listeners to feel like they entered a different world when they pressed play. And Murder Inc. mastered that better than almost anybody, especially on this project. Now, the easiest way to explain the Murderers album to younger listeners is this. Imagine if a late 90s New York crime movie somehow turned into a rap album. That's the energy. Dark, funny, violent, chaotic, emotional, and somehow all those elements worked together. Now, one thing that immediately stands out while listening to the project is the production. The beats sounded cinematic, not just hard. Cinematic. Everything felt dramatic, like something important was happening, and honestly, that was Irv Gotti's greatest strength as a producer and executive. The man understood emotion. Even when the records were aggressive, there was still tension underneath the music. That's why Murder Inc. records aged differently than a lot of other street rap from that era. Now, another thing that made this album special was how natural the chemistry felt between everybody involved. Because this didn't sound like a label forcing artists together. Nah, it sounded like a real crew. You could hear friendships, tension, street humor, personalities clashing, real energy. That authenticity matters, especially on albums built around group chemistry. Now, this is also where artists like Black Child, Cadillac Ta, and Vita became incredibly important because they gave the project character. Every person added a different energy to the world of the album. Black Child sounded wild and unpredictable. Cadillac Ta sounded gritty and grounded. Vita brought aggression and presence. And honestly, Vita's role on this project still feels underrated historically, because she didn't sound like somebody trying to fit in with the men around her. She sounded comfortable in the chaos. That made her stand out immediately. And honestly, the more you revisit this album, the more surprising it becomes that her solo career never fully exploded afterward, because during this era, she felt like somebody Murder Inc. was building around heavily. Now, another major reason this project feels cinematic is the skits. And honestly, this is where younger audiences might not fully understand how important skits used to be. Back then, skits weren't random filler. They were scene transitions. That's the difference. Especially on albums like this. The Chris Black skits, the conversations, the arguments, the street humor, all of it built atmosphere. It made the album feel alive, like these people actually existed inside the same world. And honestly, that world building is what modern streaming era albums are missing badly. Now everything is optimized for short attention spans, playlists, TikTok clips, algorithm performance. But back then, albums were built to be experienced from front to back. That's why projects took longer to create. Artists cared about pacing, emotional buildup, storytelling arcs. And the Murderers album absolutely reflects that era of music creation. Now, another thing that made this project feel huge at the time was the guest appearances. Because when names like DMX, Jay-Z, Memphis Bleek, Busta Rhymes started appearing on a Murder Inc. project, that gave the album real weight, especially during that Def Jam era. Now, another important detail about the album is how dark it feels emotionally. And honestly, that darkness became part of Murder Inc.'s identity before the mainstream crossover era fully happened. People forget that before. The shiny videos, the Ashanti records, the radio hits, Murder Inc. felt dangerous, street-oriented, unpredictable, and the Murderers album captured that version of the label perfectly. Now, listening back today almost feels eerie historically, because you can hear a movement right before it transforms completely. Before the platinum success, the commercial dominance, the FBI drama, the 50 Cent war, this album feels like the calm before the explosion. And honestly, that's part of what makes it so fascinating now, because it captured Murder Inc. at the exact moment before everything changed forever. One reason the Murderers album still feels different from a lot of compilation projects today is simple. It sounded like a real crew, not a label trying to force chemistry, not random artists emailing verses back and forth. This sounded like people who were actually around each other constantly, and that energy made the project feel alive. Now, one of the biggest standouts on the entire album was Vita, and it's honestly strange how little people talk about her today considering how important she felt during this era, because before Ashanti became the commercial face of Murder Inc., Vita felt like the original female voice of the movement. And unlike a lot of women artists during that period, Vita wasn't positioned as soft, glamorous, radio-friendly. She sounded gritty, comfortable around chaos, like somebody who genuinely fit inside the street atmosphere Murder Inc. was building. That mattered, especially on a project like this, because the Murderers album wasn't built around polished radio records. It was built around energy, and Vita added personality to that energy every time she appeared. Now looking back, it's actually surprising her career didn't become bigger afterward, because during this era, she felt heavily involved in the movement. Then suddenly, She almost disappeared from mainstream music conversations completely, and that mystery makes her role on this album even more interesting today, especially for fans revisiting the project years later. Now, another thing that made this album work was the chemistry between everybody involved: Blackchild, Cadillac Ta, Time, Shade Scheist, Ronnie Bumps. Everybody brought a different texture to the project. Blackchild sounded explosive. Cadillac Ta brought that gritty New York energy. Time added personality. Even the smaller appearances helped the album feel layered. That's important, because old school hip-hop albums used to feel populated, like worlds filled with different characters, and the Murderers album absolutely had that feeling. Now, the features also gave the project major credibility, because once artists like DMX, Jay-Z, Memphis Bleek, Busta Rhymes started appearing on the album, the project instantly felt bigger. This wasn't underground mixtape energy anymore. This was Def Jam era New York dominance, and each feature added something different emotionally. DMX brought raw aggression, Jay-Z brought that calculated slickness, Busta brought controlled chaos, Memphis Bleek added that Rockefeller energy that defined New York during that era. The album felt connected to the entire city musically. That's part of what makes it feel historic now. Now, another underrated piece of the project was Lil Mo, because even though the album leaned heavily into gritty street energy, Murder Inc. always understood balance. That was Irv Gotti's genius. He understood how to mix pain, melody, aggression, emotion inside the same project. That balance later became the entire foundation of the Ja Rule and Ashanti era. You can actually hear the blueprint forming on this album already. Now, one thing younger audiences might miss today is how important crew albums used to be culturally. Back then, labels wanted to feel like movements, not just businesses. That's why Rough Riders felt like a movement Rockefeller, felt like a movement Cash Money, felt like a movement Dipset, felt like a movement, and Murder Inc. absolutely felt like one too. The Murderers album captured that feeling perfectly. Everybody sounded connected emotionally, connected culturally, connected through the same atmosphere. That authenticity is hard to fake. Now, another reason the album aged well is because it never sounded too commercial. That's important. A lot of early 2000s projects became trapped inside their trends, but this album still feels raw enough to revisit naturally, especially late at night, especially driving, especially for people who grew up during that era, because the project feels immersive. You don't just hear the album, you enter the environment. And that's exactly what made Murder Inc. so powerful before everything changed. The strange thing about the Murderers album is this: for the people who really know hip-hop, the project never disappeared. But for mainstream music history, it almost feels erased. And that says a lot about how quickly the music industry changed after this era. Because when you go back and listen to the album today, it's obvious this wasn't some low-effort side project. There was real vision here, real atmosphere, real chemistry, real personality. But timing changed everything. Now around the early 2000s, Murder Inc. started evolving rapidly as a label. The gritty street aesthetic was still there. But suddenly, Ja Rule started becoming something much bigger commercially. Radio exploded. The crossover records exploded. The Ashanti collaborations exploded. And once those records started dominating mainstream music, the entire public identity of Murder Inc. changed. Fast. Now, instead of being viewed primarily as YHYUPM, a dangerous New York crew, gritty Def Jam street energy, cinematic hood storytelling, the label became associated with Yinaiguais, radio hits, melodic records, relationship songs, crossover success. That shift made projects like the Murderers album start feeling disconnected from the newer version of Murder Inc. that mainstream audiences knew. And that's important historically, because sometimes albums don't disappear because they're bad. They disappear because the artist or label evolves past them publicly. That's exactly what happened here. Now, another major factor was the speed of the early 2000s music industry. Back then, hip-hop moved fast. Every few months there was a new movement, a new sound, a new superstar, a new beef, a new wave, and eventually, the rise of artists like 50 Cent completely shifted the atmosphere of rap again. Once G-Unit exploded, the entire energy of New York changed. Mixtapes became the center of conversation. Aggression became popular again. Street credibility became everything. And suddenly, Murder Inc. found themselves caught between two identities. Too commercial for the streets, too street for pure pop audiences. That's a difficult position to survive in long term. Now, another reason the Murderers album became overlooked is because compilation albums themselves slowly started disappearing culturally. Back then, labels treated compilation albums seriously. They were statements, world-building projects, showcases for crews, introductions to movements today. Most labels barely even attempt that anymore. Streaming changed everything. Now music is built around singles, playlists, viral moments, algorithm performance. The concept of building a cinematic crew album almost disappeared completely. And because of that, younger audiences don't always understand how much atmosphere mattered on projects like this. Now, another major factor was the downfall of physical album culture itself. Back then, people bought CDs, studied album covers, memorized skits, replayed intros, experienced albums. Front to back, the Murderers album was built for that experience. But once streaming and fast consumption culture took over, albums like this became harder for newer audiences to fully appreciate. Because this project wasn't designed for random shuffle listening. It was designed to be experienced in sequence. That's the difference. Now, another unfortunate reality is that some of the artists tied to the project slowly faded from mainstream visibility afterward, especially people like Vita, which made the album feel even more like a forgotten time capsule over the years. And ironically, that actually made the project more interesting to hardcore hip-hop fans later, because now revisiting the album feels like uncovering a hidden piece of rap history, a snapshot of Murder Inc. before, the collapse, the FBI drama, the 50 Cent war, the internet jokes before everything became mythology. And that's what makes this album so fascinating today. It captured the movement while it still felt hungry. Looking back now, the Murderers album feels less like a forgotten project and more like a time capsule, a snapshot of a version of hip-hop that barely exists anymore. Because this album came from a period where labels still cared about atmosphere, storytelling, world building, crew chemistry, cinematic experiences. And you can hear all of that inside this project. Now, the craziest part is the Murderers album was never really designed for casual listeners. This wasn't background music. This was ride around New York at night music. The type of album where the skits mattered, the intros mattered, the transitions mattered, the sequencing mattered. Every piece of the project helped build the world of Murder Inc. That's why the album still feels immersive today, especially for people who grew up during that era. Now, over time, the album slowly became more of a cult classic than a mainstream classic. And there's a big difference between the two. Mainstream classics stay visible constantly. Cult classics survive through word of mouth, through nostalgia, through memory, through real fans revisiting them over and over again. That's exactly what happened here. Because while casual listeners moved on to the radio hits, the 50 Cent era, the internet era, real hip-hop fans kept revisiting the Murderers album quietly, especially people who missed gritty New York music, crew albums, cinematic skits, raw Def Jam energy. Now, another thing that makes the album interesting historically is how clearly you can hear the future of Murder Inc. forming inside it. The emotional production, the pain music, the dramatic atmosphere. You can already hear the blueprint for Rule 336, Pain is Love, the Ja Rule / Ashanti formula starting to form. That's important, because this album almost feels like the bridge between gritty street rap and mainstream emotional rap. And Murder Inc. eventually mastered that balance better than almost anybody. Now, one thing this project also proves is that Ja Rule's success didn't happen accidentally. That's important historically, because internet culture turned Ja Rule into such a meme over the years that people forgot. The man understood albums, not just singles, albums, the intros, the sequencing, the emotional pacing, the cinematic energy. That became part of Murder Inc.'s identity for years, and this album was one of the earliest examples of that style fully developing. Now, another major reason the project aged well is because it captured a version of New York hip-hop that felt real. Not overly polished, not algorithm-driven, not designed for TikTok clips. This sounded like actual people building an actual movement together, and you can feel that while listening, especially with Vita, Blackchild, Cadillac Ta, the skits, the crew chemistry. Everything feels connected emotionally. Now, over the years, newer fans slowly started rediscovering the project online, especially through YouTube, hip-hop forums, nostalgia pages, old-school rap discussions. And every time people revisit it, the reaction is usually the same. Damn, albums really used to feel like this? That's the power of atmosphere. Now today, the album represents something bigger than just Murder Inc. history. It represents the lost art of immersive hip-hop albums. Back when artists wanted you to live inside a project instead of just streaming random songs individually. And maybe that's why the album still feels powerful years later. Because even though the industry changed, even though Murder Inc. collapsed, even though the internet moved on, the atmosphere of this project survived. An atmosphere is timeless. If y'all enjoyed this documentary, hit that like button, subscribe to Fake Famous, and comment what classic hip-hop album from the early 2000s still feels cinematic when you listen to it today. And remember, this is Hip Hop History Month. We got more legendary documentaries, rise and fall stories, classic album breakdowns, and untold music history dropping all summer long. Road to 2K starts now, and trust me, we're only getting started.